Well, piano was my first instrument from 8 years old until about 16. I went through exams. Couldn't play anything when people came to the house except Mozart, Beethoven, Bach, you name it. Well, at the school, when we were about 16, we had a room for the pupils, the higher pupils. And in that room there was a piano. Now, I'd heard Winifred Atwell, Boogie Woogie, just about that time, and I thought, that's good. There's a sort of rhythm and there's a melody. So it sounds good, that. So I learned how to play some of her stuff, bought a record and copied it. And I was playing it at the school. And one of the pals, one of my schoolmates, he said, "Oh, my brother's got something that sounds like that. There's more instruments, there's a trumpet and clarinet, but it sounds like that, there's a sort of beat." And I said, "Oh, great." And he said, I'll bring the record in. So he did. And it was a guy called Humphrey Lawson, and it was Get Out Here and Going Home. And I listened to it there. I couldn't make head nor tail of it. So I went and bought the record myself, and I listened to it avidly, and eventually I discovered it was a trumpet that was playing the tune. And the other instruments were doing what I called at that time variations on the tune. And of course there was the chords coming from the rhythm section. So I was really intrigued with this. And we had a jazz club in Falkirk. A jazz club was formed. It was amazing. All the folk that were into jazz, which I didn't know anything about at that time, all came together. And in that group there was musicians. The guy called Charlie Malley played the trumpet. Bill Silcock was another guy who played the trumpet. Well, Charlie, he did become famous, He formed a band in Falkirk called the Memphis Jazz Band with me on the clarinet, but I can't remember the names of the rest of the guys. But anyway, Charlie formed this band, as I said, and we got a few gigs here and there. And eventually, I went to Glasgow to study at the Royal College of Science and Technology, or the Tech as it was called. And there was a jam session there. Musicians who were at the Tech at that time. One of them was called Graham Stark, who's still playing in Glasgow at the moment. Another one was called Gordon Faultless. Another guy, Norrie McFarlane. Norrie had a band actually in Glasgow called the Esquire Jazz Band. And it was good fun. And we also had a lady singer, a young lady called Fiona Duncan, whom I think you've probably interviewed. And she came along and sang as well. So eventually Graham, who played the piano, said to me, "How about forming a band? In the college here, we've got enough musicians." And I said, "Aye, okay." And I said, "Who's going to play the trumpet?" And Graham said, "Oh, I'll play the trumpet." Not only did he play the piano, he was a good trumpet player. So we formed this band, which we called the Tech Jazz Band. And we played gigs in the college. And eventually we got more gigs round about. So it was
So how did you get from doing classical piano to listening to the Humphrey Lyttelton album, thinking there's the trumpet, to the clarinet? Yeah. How did it sort of morph into you picking up the clarinet?
I should have mentioned that. What happened there was I was so intrigued with the music, I thought I'll take up the trumpet. But it was unfortunate. I had an accident playing football, headed a guy's head and slacking my 2 front teeth. And they did tighten up, but not enough to play the trumpet. So I decided, well, I'll just go for the clarinet. And luckily, there was a teacher available. So I went along to a pawn shop and got a simple system clarinet for about £6 it was at that time. And even though it was high pitch, unfortunately. So I couldn't really play in a band. But anyway, I learned the rudiments from this guy. And also another student, pupil of this chap, he played the alto. He was more advanced, much better. He actually played, in a group. And he said to me, he says, no, I'm going to Glasgow for lessons to a guy called Derek Hawkins. Now, Derek played with a huge band, big dance band, English dance band, called Ted Heath. And Derek, unfortunately, had gone deaf. So he packed in the big band, came to Glasgow, and St Vincent Street, he got himself a studio. He repaired the instruments, he taught the instruments, the reeds, and he also sold instruments. So I went along and arranged that he would teach me. And he had a few clarinets, because the simple system was no good, high-pitched. So he sold me a Marigot clarinet, which I still have. I don't know, I think I should, I'll tell you the story about this Marigot, because it could be interesting as well. And later on in the 60s, I went to Dundee to play in the East Coast Jazz Band, because the clarinet player, Andy Tully, he was an impresario and he ran the Arran Jazz Festival, so he was out for the summertime. So I went along there, and for 1964 summer, 1965 summer, I played there, and I had the use of a flat, because we sometimes had gigs, consecutive days. And I'd gone for an interview to go to the Navy, the Royal Navy. So I got back from the gig in 1965, one of the gigs, and they called me up right there and then. And I had to go. And I'd left my clarinet up there, the Marigot. So, of course, I wasn't playing when I was in the Navy. But in 1976, I'd got another clarinet by that time. I went to the Stirling University to do a course, and there was one of the East Coast Jazz Band, Ron Elder, his name was, a bass player, who I'd played with. And he said, I've got your clarinet. So he took it to my house and handed it in to my wife. That was it. That was a Marigot. So that was that. So we'll have to get back to the 1950s. So in Glasgow at the Tech, we formed this band, the Tech Jazz Band, and eventually Sandy Brown brought out the McJazz record, which wasn't trad or sort of classic type jazz, but we were, Graham Stark and I we were very impressed, and we decided to do some of the numbers. We spent a lot of time learning the chords and everything and the tunes and played the numbers. So Graham said, well, we'll have to change the name of the band. I said, aye, fair enough. So we'll go a la Sandy Brown, who called their band the Fairweather Brown All-Stars. Well, we weren't presumptuous enough to call ourselves All-Stars, but we called ourselves the Stark Busby Jazz Band. Or Jazzmen, the Stark Busby Jazzmen. And unfortunate, the order of the names, because being Glasgow, we'd only played for a couple of weeks. And this guy that I knew came up to me and said, he says, how's the Stark Naked Busby Men getting on? So I thought that was fantastic. And I've kept the Busby Men as a name for any band that I've formed, in the past. Yeah.
So tell me about, I suppose, your career in jazz? Were you working during the day? How were you managing to sort of basically bring income and also keep doing what you loved? How were you managing?
Well, as a student, it was a good grant, yeah, because I was decided I was going to be a teacher. So I got this, what's called a teacher's grant. And, well, that was okay. And my wife, she worked. She did a job. And, well, we just managed for 3 years. And the university's got long holidays. I used to work as, a docker in Grangemouth in the docks. I would work there, which was good money. So that, we managed to get through. But it only lasted for 3 years because I couldn't take it. These lecturers, just spouting all this stuff that nobody had any idea about. You had to go and try and find out for yourself. So I just gave it up and decided I'd worked in industry in Grangemouth, in the Fourth Chemicals it was called at that time. I'd worked in the lab and I had started to study at Higher National, so I decided to finish that, which I did. And I got a job teaching. So at the end of the 60s, no, it was at the end of the 50s and the start of the 60s, about 61, we still had the band going, the Stark Naked Busby men. And Graham, the trumpet player, he wanted to move on because we weren't sort of doing that much. He wanted to move on. There was a lot of bands in Glasgow at that time, young bands just formed, and they were doing not so much what we were doing, but Graham was quite happy to go along and he joined one of them. They were doing traditional jazz. There was another great band in Glasgow called the Vernon Band. That was the first band I heard in Glasgow, which I went along to listen to, and they taught me a lot. They were just the same age as me, but they were into it. They really knew the score. And of course there was another guy called Forry Cairns, and Forry had a gig in the ladies' union at the university on a Friday. And I used to go along. I had a flat just across the road and I used to go along and listen to Forry. He was a great clarinet player. The Clansman, it was called. So he influenced me as well.
So you talked about it was more traditional scene in Glasgow. So what were you and the Vernon? What were the people that were influencing you and you wanted to be like? What sounds who were influencing you? Where were you getting it from?
Where was I getting it from?
Yeah. So what sounds did your bands have that were different from the rest of the Glasgow scene?
Yeah. Well, I think it was just because what we wanted. Graham and I were influenced by Sandy Brown, the Edinburgh clarinet player. I mean, I was very much so. And we played a lot of his stuff, you know. And of course, when the McJazz came out, we went on to that as well. So it was a bit different. You see, the Vernon was more of a classic New Orleans style band, the only one in Glasgow. None of the other Glasgow ones, they were more sort of British revival type jazz, you know. There was a lot of bands in Britain at that time.
And were you, had you begun touring at that point, or were you just working within Glasgow?
No, just in Glasgow. I lived in Glasgow for 3 years, even though my hometown was Falkirk. Lived in Glasgow in a flat, or different flats. And 1960, when I packed in the tech, I left Glasgow, went back. I had a few gigs with Graham during that time, you know, in the early 60s, but really nothing much happened apart from the Dundee business during the 60s. So as I say, I joined the Navy in 1965, and again 3 years. That seems to be my limit. Managed to get out. I got a gratuity, so it wasn't bad. So I managed to get out, and my old pal, I forgot to mention him, John Arthur. I knew John Arthur from early days, and he had a dance band in Falkirk during the 50s, and he had heard Chris Barber, and he'd got himself a trombone, even though he played the piano in the band, and he got himself a trumpet player, and he said, you know, let's do some jazz. And he came along and asked me if I'd play the clarinet, you know, for 2-3 numbers, and I'd get paid for it, you know. And we did that. But it was in 1968 when I left the Navy. He got in touch with me, and we formed what was called the Dr. McJazz Band. Again, after Sandy Brown, because Sandy Brown produced a record, Dr. McJazz. No mind of her own. Anyway, Dr. McJazz had another Falkirk guy in it, Gus Mackay. He originally played the banjo, but he moved over to the bass because he was playing in the local dance bands at that time for money. So he moved over to the bass, but he joined the trad band. And we had a guy called Arthur Ferguson on the drums. Now, Arthur was a pal of mine. I mean, I was a climber. I used to go rock climbing with Arthur, you know, go away for weekends, doing stupid things, hanging from rocks and everything like that. And anyway, Arthur, he eventually went to Edinburgh to play with Charlie McNair at the, I think it must have been in the 60s. But he didn't play for Charlie McNair very long. And you know this, I asked people in Edinburgh, you remember Arthur Ferguson? Can't remember him at all. Yet, Arthur played with Charlie McNair, and he got me gigs. I remember playing in one of the Sandy Brown pubs. God, I can't remember the name now. I should. Anyway, it was a famous place at that time at the west end of Edinburgh. And I remember playing with Charlie McNair because Arthur got me the gig. Simple as that. And nobody remembers him. So, as I say, there was a lot of influences going on. And even when I heard Dave Paxson, I'd heard about Dave Paxson. He was a contemporary of Sandy Brown. Now, 1972, we had formed the Dr. McJazz Band, and we were doing the odd gig. And sometimes we went to the outskirts of Edinburgh, but we had no idea what was going on in Edinburgh. We never even thought about it until it was an article in the local Falkirk newspaper, the Falkirk Herald. And in that article, they mentioned that there was going to be a band called the Scottish Jazz Advocates coming to Falkirk to play in the Calendar Park. No. So, great. I went along. I couldn't believe it. Dave Paxson, Bob Craig, Ian Telford, Mike Hart. Can't remember. Oh, it was Ian Ford on the drums. Oh, a fantastic band. And I went along to chat with them because I did know one or two of them, you know. And I went along, I said, you know, I had no idea this was going on in Edinburgh. I said, oh, why, we've been playing for years, huh? So that was how I got introduced to Edinburgh, apart from the early gig that I did with the Climax. John and I, John Arthur, the Dr. McJazz guy, we went to Edinburgh on occasion to listen to Jim Petrie, because Jim played in the Glen Elk Hotel, and he played there for years. And he had a really good band then. And because we had been introduced to Edinburgh, we went along to Edinburgh and got ourselves involved with some of these bands.
So when the band, was it the Scottish Jazz Advocates, when they came to Falkirk and you sort of heard them and thought, didn't know that was happening, was it profoundly different from what you were doing? And if so, how did you then learn to play like that?
No, it wasn't really, because I should have mentioned that in the 50s, in Glasgow, there was a guy called Cliff Stanton. Now, Cliff had a record shop. And because I'd gone to Glasgow, I discovered this record shop. And it was wall-to-wall records. All the old classic 1920s jazz, all the bands. He had everything. And that Cliff Stanton, he actually formed the Glasgow Jazz Club, which ended up with, which involved the competition, the jazz competition. Clyde Valley Stompers and all these bands, the Vernon, the Mull, they all joined. We even did it ourselves. Graham and I at one time went into the competition. It was Cliff Stanton that started that. And as I say, I got all these records. And the reason I knew about these records was there was a guy called Rex Harris, an English chap. He was really into jazz, and he wrote a book, Jazz, that was what he called it. And he started off in the 19th century and went right through the beginning in the 20th century, and mentioned all the bands right up until the 30s. And that's how I got to know the names of these bands. And he even put the numbers of the records. So that's what I knew, how to purchase the records, what to buy. Rex Harris.
So in terms of sort of moving away from Falkirk into Edinburgh, how did was it just informally that you were sort of getting the odd gig, or how did that sort of come about?
Well, we just, as I say, John and I went to Edinburgh to listen to these bands, and of course I helped us. Charlie Malley, the guy I mentioned earlier, he started playing in Edinburgh with Mike Hart. And of course, whenever they were short of a clarinet player, they got me. And short of a trombone player, they got John. And that was in the sort of early 70s. And that's how we got into Edinburgh. Of course, other people heard us. And about 1976, as I say, I used to go along to Glen Elk. I don't know how Jim got to hear about me, but he booked me. And I played with his band in the Glen Elk from 1977 for about a couple of years, to 78. And John Arthur was playing as well. He got the job as well. It was a good band. I've got CDs, of all these bands. It was incredible, really.
Where did you record? Which studio were you recording?
No, we just, the Glen Elk, Jim Peary's band in the Glen Elk, it was a friend of mine. He had one of these old tape recorders. And I don't know, he must have plugged it in at the Glen Elk. He must have found a plug, because he recorded. Yeah. And I think maybe at that time as well, the small tapes, maybe at that time there was instruments like that. I mean, that was in the 70s. I should imagine there was something like that. But I know that a lot of our bands were recorded that way, rather than going to studios. I've never liked going to studios. I only did it once. And I like natural improvisation, as it comes. Mistakes and all. And it's amazing, even the best bands make mistakes. So I've heard them. Yeah.
So moving into the 80s, how was the sort of scene changing, or was it
Well, in 1978, that was when I left. I went to Oman. I was a qualified teacher at that time, and also because I'd been climbing and that, I got a job in the forces in Oman. Of course, I'd been in the Navy as well. And it was the Omani Air Force that I joined. And they gave me I was a flight lieutenant. They gave me a uniform and everything. But I only lasted 6 weeks teaching the cadets chemistry. I think that's what it was, chemistry. And they looked at my resume and they noticed that I had been a climber. So they were wanting to kick out the guy that was doing the job at the time, Leadership and Adventure Training School, training all the young officers to be, to keep fit and things like that. So they were getting fed up with him. So they got rid of him and they booked me after 6 weeks. So I spent from 78 to 82 leadership and adventure training, climbing all over Oman. It was incredible that I managed to get a job like that. Just pure luck. But again, I can only last so long. This time 4 years, not 3. That's good. So I left, came back, and I'd only got back to Edinburgh and visited a few of the clubs in Edinburgh, the gigs, when Tom Bryce, he was the leader of the West End Jazz Band. They had a gig in the Ailsa Craig Hotel in Edinburgh, just, I think it was Royal Terrace, I think. And I played with the West End Jazz Band for a couple of years. And then I left to go to Saudi Arabia. Stayed there for a couple of years. Never played, but one thing I did do, especially when I was in Oman, I practiced. And in Oman, I managed to buy instruments cheap, a tenor sax and an alto. And I learned how to play them there. But even though I didn't play gigs, except occasionally when I came home and leave. So after Saudi Arabia, 84, I got a job locally, and we formed, it was a festival, Edinburgh Festival, and there was this young lady who was running a pub down the high street called the Sava. When she heard the band there, and I had gone up to sit in with them, and she approached me and she says, I'd like a band like that in my pub. So I said, okay, I'll get you a band. So I did. Jim Petrie, myself, Bob Craig, Ian Ford, Jock Westwater, another guy, banjo player. He played with Jim Petrie. I forgot to mention him in the Glen Elk. And we formed this band, and we played in the Sava, and that was another thing. In the Sava, I think we just called the band, I think it was just the Jim Petrie's jazz band or Bob Busby's jazz band, I can't remember. It was just an innocuous name. But we used to get extra gigs at the Sava. One was on a Saturday afternoon, I remember, and we got there early, and none of the people were in for the meals or drinks or anything like that in the pub. It was deserted. And this yellow dog appeared. It was a Labrador or a setter. It was one of these. I can't remember exactly. And it started cocking its leg round all the tables. So there was a tune called the Yellow Dog Blues. So I thought, that's a good name. That Yellow Dog reminded me of that. So we called the band at Savannah Yellow Dog Jazz Band eventually. But then, of course, the gig collapsed, and these gigs never lasted very long. And there was a tremendous club at that time formed at the Basin Street at Haymarket. This venue was really great, and that's where all the Edinburgh bands played, different nights of the week. At that time, Mike Hart, he had a band on a Saturday night, but he couldn't make it on occasion, because he has so many gigs, different gigs. So he says to me, will you put a band in? I said, aye. So I got a band in, this must have been about 86. It was Jim Petrie, myself, and Beverly Knight, the lady banjo player, who plays with the Diplos now. And we had Simon Carlyle on the sousaphone, Roger Hanley on the drums. And we played on a Saturday night at the Basin Street. So, coming from, a hick town like Falkirk, which is not the way we say it, but I won't say it now because it sounds rude. Falkirk, being a hick town, we had an accent. And the Yellow Dog just didn't fit in as far as I was concerned. So I renamed it the Yellow Dog. And again, I've got CDs of that band that were made from tapes. It's good. And we played for a while there.
And then moving into the 90s, how was it changing then?
Before I went into the 90s, in 1988, I had been interviewed by the British Overseas Council or League, or whatever they call it. And they took me up on a post in Zambia. So I went to Zambia, and I was there for nearly 4 years. And again, even though I heard some jazz bands from England and Zambia, I never played there. But I kept practicing as usual. And after Zambia, I came back 91, 92. And of course, I joined up again with John Arthur and the Dr. McJazz. We had a few gigs there. I mean, he played regularly in Edinburgh by that time. In fact, he was playing in what was called Young's Hotel, which was the old Glen Elg. They had renamed it Young's. And he actually played. And they wouldn't accept him in Edinburgh because he had Gus Mackay, as I told you, this bass he'd formed. He was playing an electric bass. Yeah, they wouldn't accept that. Yet, Diz Jackson, the Sandy Brown bass player, he actually played at the Glen Elg with Jim Petrie's band. When I was playing, he played an electric bass. No, it didn't sound any different to me, but they just wouldn't accept it. They couldn't get gigs at the Basin Street, things like that.
And in terms of young people coming up, where in the same way that you were all kind of encouraged and brought on, was that still happening through all of the time that you've been performing, that young people are coming up?
Well, I was really, really conscious of this. There was one young guy, I think maybe Jim mentioned him, because he played with Jim, trombone player, good trombone player. Funnily enough, he arrived back in Edinburgh 2-3 weeks ago and sat in with us. But I haven't heard of him since. I can't remember his name now. And I haven't written it down. But he was about the only young guy I can remember, really. It was always the same people that we've associated with. And it's only now that young people are coming along. Yeah.
And is that young people coming along in the audience or to play or both?
Well, when I played in Glasgow from 2011 to 2016, it was 5 years I played in Glasgow. It was an Edinburgh clarinet player, George Duncan, who actually played with this band. It was a guy called Muldoon. He formed a band. It was a bit of a stickler. He had was it OCD or ODC? Yeah, he had that, but it never bothered me. We would make fun of him, the trumpet player. Andy Lauder was a trumpet player. Andy and I would make fun of him behind his back. But we did the gig, and it was a great gig. And the Glasgow people thought it was great. And they would come along to this pub. Again, no names. It was down Jamaica Street. They'll maybe come back to me. But anyway, this pub was full every Saturday with this band. And it was really great. I had to play a tune called St. Philip Street Breakdown every week. I think I played it 257 times in the 5 years. I think I worked that out. But the Glasgow audience, you know, they were fantastic. It's always been the same. Now, how did I go into that?
So I was asking about whether there's the young musicians coming up and following the same path you did, and sort of having sitting in and.
Well, again, in that Glasgow gig, it was all the old guys. Kit Carey, he was on the banjo. Well, one of the banjo players. I mean, the Edinburgh guy, Bill Salmon, he came through and played eventually. And there was Ronnie Ray on the bass, Fiona's partner. It was a good band. And we had, this was quite interesting, we had, it was Czechoslovakian, something like that. He was an immigrant anyway, he came into Britain. And Hugh Muldoon, he was wandering down, one of the streets, the street that does all the guys playing instruments and things like that. And he had this drummer. And he said, "No, that's great." And he went and asked him. Of course, he couldn't speak English very well, but he understood eventually. And they said, "Yeah, okay." And he got this guy in. And he played all the time I was there. Charlie Nouse, his name was. Before he went back to wherever it was, Czechoslovakia, something like that.
And finally, do you have a strongest memory, or is it more just of thinking back over your sort of career playing? What do you remember most about it?
Well, I've had a few different gigs. For example, with an English band, the Savannah, the clarinet player died, and they got another guy, Rod Chambers, to take his place. But Rod had a lot of gigs with his own band at that time. So the Savannah got me to play. And, they're still playing the Savannah. I thought they were absolutely fantastic. Especially it was the rhythm section. They could drive and they could swing. That was a great experience. But I would never have joined that band because they had gigs practically every night. And they were professional and they were going around the country, living in hotels. I had a spell of this living in hotels. No way would I have done that. But I've had a few good laughs. Charlie McNair, he was some guy, Charlie. Remember, I was doing a gig with him in a hotel down the Cowgate, a pub down the Cowgate. And Charlie had problems with his prostate at that time, and he had the colostomy bag. So he said, "Okay, guys, you ready? We're playing this number." And he went, "Squelch, squelch, 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 squelch," on purpose. And of course, the whole place folded up. The band couldn't play. It was incredible, really. Another time, Charlie, it was an Edinburgh Festival, I can't remember, years ago, and he announced that he was going to do I'm Confessing, but he was going to do it in Czechoslovakia. And his accent, I mean, it was a load of rubbish, but his accent was fantastic. And of course, it was really funny. And again, the whole place collapsed with laughter. Charlie, he was like that. He was some guy. Things like that. Oh, I was doing it at the Wreath Festival in Yorkshire. I think it was Phil Mason that run that at one time. Anyway, it was with the Diplomats of Jazz. Oh, by the way, I must mention just after this, the Diplomats of Jazz at Wreath. I was standing at the bar having a drink at the interval, and this lady came up to me and she says, "Oh, that was very good. You're very good. I don't know you. I've never heard of you before. What's your name?" I said, "Bob Busby." And she says, in a loud voice, "Bob who?" And of course, Bill Bryan heard that, and it was all around Edinburgh. In fact, he even started it was a mythical publication called Bob Who's Who of Jazz.